Hello, TelecomTV is on the road. We are in The Hague in the Netherlands at the SDN NFV World Congress 2018, and this is a panel discussion on the value of open source in next generation networks, and it's sponsored by the guy I'm going to ask the first question to, Andrew Coward, who is the CEO of Lumina Networks. So let me introduce the remainder of the panel when I'm at it. On my immediate left is Alla Goldner, who is Director of Technical Strategy and Standardization at Amdocs. Alla, welcome. On my right hand side, an old friend, Gabriele De Piazza, VP Products and Solutions, Telco NFV at VMware. Gabriele, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Okay, Andrew, the first question's yours. Let's start with the very basics. Where are all the places that open source can be leveraged to deliver functional value in 5G and MEC networks?
Well, I guess the simple answer to that is almost everywhere, which is a little bit glib, but there's three key areas that open source is playing out in. The first is the control plane of the network, which is where SDN comes in, the orchestration plane, and more recently the data plane too. So those three areas, so pushing packets, controlling packets, and orchestrating the network. So open source is playing a role in all of those areas today. Okay,
that's the platform that we're starting from. Alan, I'm going to ask you to start on this one, if you would. It's about standards and open source coexisting. There's a lot of talk about sort of mutual antagonism almost between these two processes and sets of ideas. How well are the standards and open source actually coexisting, do you think? And if there's a conflict between the two, should the industry respond to this case? And is it possible to coexist to collectively drive development of 5G and multi-access computing solutions?
So I fully believe that they are complementing each other, actually, and not conflicting each other. And as a fact, I will bring on up as a case where actually we implement some of standards developed by NFV, which are relevant and demanded by the service provider participating in ONAP. And also, for instance, in Ukraine project, also raised recently by Linux Foundation, they plan to implement some of the standards raised by ETSIMEC. So it is really about those useful interfaces, those useful standards which service providers want to deploy, and then it is up to open source to actually to deliver those. So those bodies actually needs and work together already today.
Thank you. Gabriele, what's VM's viewpoint?
No, I agree. I agree they're complementary. We also seen the lines being blurred in the industry between what a standards is and what open source is. Sometimes some open source community or some open source project or quote-unquote product becomes the standard. Then if you look under the cover, sometimes it's far from being a standard. But I think, obviously I would separate what is truly telecommunication standard, because you still need to, comply into, a massive network of, interconnects and so forth. But I agree. I think this is, I've probably, like never before, I've seen an industry in transition in terms of standards. And we've been living this in the last 3, 4, 5 years. And I don't think it's over yet.
Just to add a few words, so eventually we have the same companies participating in both, and typically, those people internally are coordinated. So I think that we see more and more collaboration on that front and less confrontation.
Andrew, this is a subject near and dear to your heart. What's Lumina's take on it?
Yeah, I guess as we develop open source software, we see the standards as the guide rails. That mean that as we write the software, we know the boundaries with which we should be writing and what we need to talk to, how we speak northbound and southbound to the different appliances or the applications above us. So that creates the framework. Writing software is the show me part of the business, where the standards are the tell me. So tell me how to do it, and then the show me how you did it part, which is the software. So those two things really come together in a complementary way. I think it has been said that developing open source has really accelerated the progress, in the sense that standards had slowed down somewhat over the years. We've seen the development of 5G and how long that's taken to come. And so that sense of frustration, if you like, has been allowed the open source community to develop somewhat ahead of the standards in many cases.
I think what we've seen in recent years and months is that doing open source well is very challenging. It's fine to say this is going to be open source and the vendors are going to come along and give what the CSPs what they're demanding, what they're asking for and so on, but to do it well seems to me to be a particularly difficult thing to do. Are you finding that it is tough to do, Gabriele?
I agree. In general terms, you might argue there's more commits to open source community than debugging because of the timing. And so I sometimes find ironic that the telecommunications industry has been one of those industries that push the boundaries on what it meant to do 5 nines and carrier grades. Think of the carrier grade term, right? And now you move in a world that says open source is going to solve the problem. Obviously, I think it does from an innovation perspective, but then you need to have a very well-engineered solution if you want to run a network in production. So that's where I see, I think it's not just about producing open source, it's about how do you make it operational.
Alla, what do you think?
I think that the key here is really a collaboration of service providers with vendor in the open source community, starting from the very beginning, meaning defining of the use cases which are really needed for deployment, and not just letting it proceed by some specific vendor service provider requirements only. And as a fact, as a use case subcommittee chair in ONAP, I put a pressure on the service provider participating in ONAP. Please bring your requirements since the very beginning. Only this way, this is something which is going to be deployable at the end.
That's right, because I think so much is taking place in labs of the telecom industry around the world. Getting those things out of the labs and into the live networks, that's been the hard bit, the operationalizing, the hardening, the scaling. And those are the things, to Gabriele's point, that's not the sexy part of the industry where you've got to do the debugging, you've got to do the fixing. And yet that's the most important part and the role that's necessary to kind of get into live deployments.
You brought me very nicely, Andrew, to the next point, which is this. Where is the industry, do you think, now at testing and deploying these open source solutions? And where deployments are in place, what have we learned from it? What are the pluses and what are the minuses? What do you think, Alla?
So there are quite a few deployments in place already. What we learn is that actually open source is not a product. Open source is a platform which still needs to be productized. And so it is not something taken for free as well. And this is also some, understanding which has to be taken as is by service provider. I'm not sure 100% they are there yet, and this is something for them also to learn. So it is their turn to tell us what they require and what requirements needs to be fulfilled and what they expect from each one of the open source to achieve, but also that at the end they should take it jointly with the vendor to actually productize it and make it a product which is deployable in their network, which is called with enterprise grade quality. So I think we still have a gap there to fill, understanding wise, and this will come. Also speaking of the industry and how it involves, going in 5G on MAC direction, there are still quite a few things to be done also on that front, on what exactly is open source, where vendors can collaborate more in order to deliver the baseline jointly, as we do in network management already, also on the network side, and then innovate on top of that. And if we get there, the industry will benefit a lot.
Thank you. Gabriele.
I think there's a wide spectrum, right? Open source, there are some very mature solutions. If you look all the way back to, Linux all the way, what's happening right now. So I would say live through an industry that actually moved to some of the core platforms being, commercially deployed in open source. Some of those, maybe data plane is an example. There are different, components which are most widely deployed. Industry is an evolution. Now the whole industry is looking ahead into cloud native and what's going to happen with cloud native and control plane and orchestration there as well. So I would say that there are different degrees of maturity. A lot of the deployments are driving the actual debugging, and therefore the more deployments, the more the software becomes commercial. So that's, I say, it's an evolution, something more mature, something less.
I think the other thing that's linked to this, as we've seen the deployments from the customers that we have take place, if you don't deploy it, you don't learn. And that sounds like a very obvious thing to say, but just testing in the labs and saying, well, maybe it's ready, maybe it's not, I don't know. And so you have to get out there and actually do it. And when you do it, you go through the challenges just like any technology. But once you cross that threshold, it's like, well, why are you doing this in the first place? The ecosystem that you now have, the vendor ecosystem you now have, having crossed that threshold changes completely. The way and the relationships you have with those vendors, how they deliver product to you, how you understand the innovation that's built on your network. So it shouldn't be unclear about why you want to do it. There's so much discussion's taken place this week at this show. It's you have to cross that threshold and press that button, find the project, make it happen. Otherwise, you'll never do it.
Think of the transformation this also bringing in your traditional network equipment provider community, right? With certain life cycle, moving from typical hardware life cycle support and so forth into a software life cycle, now into an open source life cycle. So sometimes it's like, okay, how can you manage that? It's a very different type of operations these days.
Mentioned before when I was talking just then, what do you think, each of you have been involved in the deployments and seen them going on, what do you think has been learned generally from them so far? A, it's just really hard to do. B, as you say, Andrew, you've got to jump in at the deep end and get going. What do you think actually have you learned, what's happened with the deployments?
Yeah, for me operations is key. Just come out of a couple of customer meetings and everyone is looking ahead in innovation, but everybody is actually trying to consolidate their operation aspects, which will allow them to innovate and accelerate. So I think there's been a bit of a testing phase, and now it's the moment where you actually need to establish your footprint, operationalize the footprint, which will allow you to move forward.
I fully agree, and actually, again, speaking of FONAP, from one side we have all those new use cases coming into the play, lots of discussion, lots of emphasis on that, and 5G, mobile edge computing, automation, and we always have those rooms full of people, those conference calls with 50, 60 participants, and then it comes also to the discussions of, code quality and scalability, resiliency, security, what we call platform quality or S3P, and less offensive things, obviously, but this is what is needed also for deployment. So the real challenge really is to understand where the balance is and to split the development effort and integration effort correctly between those two, between the innovation, which we put there, and the platform quality, which is the key for deployments.
Thank you, Andrew.
I think at a higher level, you find out who your friends are when you do this. The vendors that come willing to the table and are actually changing their products and delivering products in that space, and the vendors that come kicking and screaming, if you like, trying to avoid going through this process. And it's fascinating to watch that play out, and how the service providers are then managing those vendors to get them through these hurdles. So it is interesting watching that, and a lot has been learned about the vendors that really are in open source, and the vendors who've just put an open source whitewash on whatever it is that they do.
Moving on for a moment away from the technology side of things, beyond those technological changes to the network, does the service provider internal culture also play a major role, whether in blocking or whether in facilitating whatever it may be, when it comes to open source deployments? Or is it something which is just completely separate and you put all the stuff in and the network gets going and then you hope the culture changes?
Oh, I see service providers progressively taking a much more active role than in the past. Question is this accelerating or slowing down? Different discussion, no. But I think it's a good thing. You cannot have a vendor-driven community because I would actually argue that service providers should be much faster in adoption, not just in contributing and participating into the different communities, but actually much faster in adoption, because I will actually foster much more innovation. If you look at the community of startups as an example, you cannot have startups working on years and years and years just in trial and piloting, right? That would be, I think service providers are part of this equation, and so not just participating in the standard, in the discussion, but in actually adopting it and going much faster. It's
fascinating that it's service provider by service provider have realized that they have to bring innovation back in-house. It's almost like they've outsourced too much, and they've outsourced their future. So the recognition that they have to innovate and they have to have some of the expertise in-house in order to make these new decisions. And so the success that we've seen with service providers is when they've built their own teams of experts and people who really understand this, who can then work with the right vendors to then move forward. Because otherwise, we just get the same RFPs and RFIs as if it's 1995 all over again. Yeah, we have to change that, and that's really the success we've seen with the carriers who've actually gone through that whole process.
I actually see several challenges. So some are related to those, reskilling challenge that we heard several service providers talking about this, even during this show. Orange, Deutsche Telekom, AT&T frequently talks about this. The other part is that, the internal, I would not say conflict, but challenge between the operations from one side and those R&D people, on service provider side, actually participating in open source and standards activity. And also the cultural barrier, then they have to expose their requirements in open source communities. For instance, if they want those requirements to be implemented, they're not willing yet because their culture prevents them to expose those requirements publicly. So those are challenges. I think they are trying very hard to overcome those. Some of them did quite a lot of success on that front, but they're going through the process right now. So hopefully they will be successful.
This cultural thing is very difficult to quantify. And we all know, we've all been in companies and organisations where they're dead set against change. But given that change is being thrust upon them one way or another, obviously in the not too longer term, they're going to have to change. Do you see that change taking place now? You mentioned AT&T and others that are very proactive in this, but what about those that aren't?
I think that many of them change. In fact, if you look on open source community, I would not say it is going easy, but it is proceeding. And we see more and more service providers, and as a fact, we see even more service providers contributing. They're not putting that many of their people, but they're starting to put their people on the real development of the open source code along with the vendor. So I'm quite optimistic. I think they realize they need that change, because if they proceed with the existing behavior as used to be before, they will not be able to innovate. They are also facing a very tough competition right now. They realize that only in case they'll be able to compete, they'll be able to succeed with 5G, with the mobile edge computing, and with all those things. So they really try hard, in my view, to build that baseline jointly, and then only innovate, as I said before, on top of it with AI and with all other new things which are coming into the play.
Thank you. Gabriele, about you, do you find that some are better than others at this cultural thing?
I would say pretty evenly, but there are some differences. Some carriers, they have a much more an approach on development, and insourcing. And I agree with Andrew. You cannot outsource your future, so you need to become an expert. As a matter of fact, I think even the traditional NEP system integration model is changing, right? If your network is now softer and cloudified, you need to have the skills. But I actually think some carriers differ. Some of them, they actually do have the skills, some don't. Some are larger, some are smaller. Some have very small personnel, so there will be a variety out there. But each one of them, they need to become experts in a way or in another. How deep the development, how deep a bench they have, it's a different story.
Long term, to your earlier question, the markets will punish those that don't follow because they won't be competitive, they won't be able to deploy services quickly, their cost base will be higher, they won't have automated. So this is a survival thing that's playing out, it's just playing out in slow motion.
Okay. Coming to the last question, I'm going to ask each of you in turn to respond to this, because it's about your individual companies. I'm going to start with you, Alla, if I might, and Amdocs. Where does your company, Amdocs, provide unique value to service providers trying to deploy open source solutions in their next generation networks? And what is your long-term view of the networking space we've been discussing?
Amdocs is known as a service integrator for many years and has been quite successful on that front. And starting from 3.5 years ago, when Amdocs actually started to participate and actively contribute, co-create eComp, then lately turned to be ONUP, that was the first big attempt where Amdocs went for something different. So we are 3 years after the start of that journey. we are still there and succeeding, right? The first 2 deployments with AT&T and Bell Canada, we support, and we continue to be heavily involved in ONAP. I think we are number 2 contributor in ONAP. We provide a very unique value. Not all of our expertise on service integration side, but actually our real development skill, our architecture skill, our system knowledge. We are expert in several quite important modules of ONAP. So this is a mix of both. As I said before, eventually vendor will be needed to bring the system to the service provider. On top of that, really, there is a need of the real code and how code is developed and how it is architectured in order to be successful in deploying it. So this is where Amdocs clearly can play a key role.
Thank you. Gabriele and VMware, same question.
Same, so very wide as well. I can speak for the telecommunication industry, but that would be just a small subset of what VMware does. We brought in a chief open source officer a couple of years ago, so VMware actually moving rapidly into multiple and contributing to multiple communities. From foundational communities all the way to telco specific. Obviously in telco, my group is involved in core initiatives. ONAP, as Ala said, we are actually chairing some core committee. We've been founding members there. We are involved in OSM with Etsy. We have active participation, very active participation in the OpenStack community. Obviously, the whole world is going towards Kubernetes, so we are part of CNCF and so forth. But I would say these are just the tip of the spear. There are many other communities supporting the data plane perspective and so forth. So a lot of interest, and I see VMware adopting and embracing, but with the spirit of actually making it commercially viable.
Thank you. Last word with you, Andrew.
Yeah, so I guess for us, and obviously the whole founding of Lumina was on really what we regard as the kind of pivot point within the network, the control plane. We talked at the beginning of 3 parts, 3 places you can really touch open source orchestration, control, and the data plane. Well, it turns out that the control plane is most interesting to start with, because what that essentially does once you've put open source into that place, it enables you to drive business logic directly to control without having to worry about what the underlying hardware is. I can turn on the service now and know that it can cross 3 different manufacturers' products, 3 different protocols, 3 different types of systems or more. The control plane is key as a starting place for this open source journey, because once you do that, you unlock the ability to bring open source above it and below it and around it. And that's really why we started there and why we think the SDN control plane of these networks is so critical.
Thank you. We're out of time now, so Alan Goldner, Gabriele Piazza and Andrew Coward, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.